America is the land of opportunity. So how should we respond when new evidence shows that some families actually feel discouraged from working harder for the American dream?
The reality is most Americans on the right and the left are concerned about their fellow Americans, and we can unite on this.
On this episode, we discuss benefits cliffs and how to improve the nation's social safety net and workforce programs to empower more families to take advantage of the economic opportunities they want to pursue. You're listening to Defending Ideas. Defending Ideas is a weekly podcast produced by Sutherland Institute. On this show, we are committed to renewing the principles of common sense conservatism, making you a better champion of sound ideas. Welcome to another episode of Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nic Dunn, and this week we're talking once again about the American dream, about upward mobility and the opportunity that can come from working hard and taking advantage of the economic opportunities in Utah and other states throughout the nation, and particularly how we can improve our social safety net and programs to help more families achieve the American dream. I'm very excited for our special guest to have this conversation. His name is Randy Hicks, and he's the president and CEO of the Georgia Center for Opportunity. Randy, welcome to Defending Ideas.
Thanks, Nick. It's great to be with you.
Randy, I'm excited to talk to you about this, but when we thought about, okay, who can we bring on to help have this conversation, you were the first person who came to mind. And it's because, number one, just your organization, the Georgia Center for Opportunity, has been such a leading organization, not just within Georgia, but I would say in other states and across the nation, on how we strengthen and improve our safety net system and our workforce systems to, again, help families move forward. And I've heard you talk about this issue in a way that's empowering because it focuses on the families themselves, that they're the hero of the story. So I just want to kind of give that shout out to GCO. The organization is a great leader and a great partner of Sutherland on this stuff, and appreciative for everything that you all do on these issues.
Well, I appreciate that, Nick. One of the great things about what we get to do is we get to work with people like you and the folks at Sutherland. So it's certainly not us alone. This is teamwork, not just at GCO, but across the country with people like you. And so we consider ourselves very blessed to be able to do the kind of work that we do.
Well, the feeling's mutual. I appreciate that, Randy. Let's start off with kind of a bigger picture question, just because we're still pretty close to the completion of the election cycle. You know, we know we're going to have a new presidential administration, a new Congress. So first, I want to ask you, in your view, what should the sort of opportunity vision or opportunity agenda of the nation be when we have these folks take office or fill these positions in the coming months? What's top of mind for you for the United States?
Well, I think one of the things you can certainly expect with this administration, because we saw it in the first Trump administration, they're going to be pretty aggressive in spurring economic and job growth. And I think that's great. For me, top of my mind is what we've been talking about, our two organizations, and that is reforming a safety net so that it in such a way that it doesn't trap people or discourage people from entering the workforce. And by the way, also, so it doesn't trap and discourage people from entering stable family life by entering marriage. So there's a lot to do here, a lot of issues to address, but we believe that reforming the safety net system is absolutely vital for this to work well. And I would say, as you know, the very specific policy we're excited about, and we hope we can get this done even between now and the time that President Trump is inaugurated, is the one-door policy, which we're likely going to talk about a bit here on this call, but we think that should be a major priority, giving more states the ability to integrate workforce and welfare programs.
Randy, one of the things that stands out to me about the Georgia Center for Opportunity and what you're articulating with the one-door approach and kind of safety net reform is that everything is really oriented around, you know, what I would say are the one of the two pillars of America, the American experiment, the American dream. And it's a huge oversimplification to say that America is about these two things, but I would say it's about freedom and opportunity. protecting our essential rights, the constitutional structure we have to do that. And then you articulate job growth and economic opportunity. It's really about creating a place where people can work hard and see the fruits of their labor to be able to create a better life for their families. And so what you're articulating, and I think from my perspective, what GCO does is really the focus on strengthening the American dream. Can you talk a little bit about, one, I guess anything you want to say about the organization that people ought to know, and two, why those things specifically of reforming and improving the safety net and also improving our workforce programs and seeing how those things can work together better, why do you think that's so essential to that overall mission?
Yeah, let me a couple of things. One is if there's a defining American idea, it's that everyone should have an opportunity to achieve a better life, irrespective of the circumstances of their birth, their race, their beliefs. Everybody should have an opportunity to achieve a better life. That's why people came here. It was this idea that if I go to the United States, I'll be able to achieve that better life. We've got a system that often discourages that. We have different barriers that have been built into, unintentionally, I believe, the welfare system. So it's harder for people who are currently poor to escape poverty. One of the things that Mauricio Miller says, he's a poverty fighter in the Bay Area, actually. He says, in America, we've made poverty survivable, but not escapable. And that really rings true to me. And I think to a large degree, that rings true to a lot of low income and poor Americans. I can survive this, but I can't escape it. It's too difficult. And the reason why work is so important, it's important at so many levels. If you look at the research done by Brookings Institution, right? The Brookings Institution, which is a center-left organization. It's not like some right-wing organization. But essentially, they did a literature review and said, of all the people in America who have at least graduated from high school, found steady employment, waited till they were married to have kids, only 2 to 3% of them are in poverty. Of those who've gotten those three things wrong, it's about 70% who are in poverty at this moment in time. That's a vast difference. And it makes sense that if people aren't equipped for the workforce and they can't find jobs, their entire lives are going to be pretty unstable. And I would add this, that when we think about what it means to be human, Nick, we're about purpose and belonging. We want to know that what we do matters, and we need to know that we matter. We matter to someone. And oftentimes work is where we find that. It's the way that we connect well to our community and well to others. We provide for our families. That sense of purpose and belonging is so often found in what we do from a work perspective.
If we can build on that for a second, this idea of purpose and belonging and meaning, we hear often the term the dignity of work, and I've referenced probably a dozen times on this show some of the work of Arthur Brooks in his book, The Conservative Heart, that really gets to the core of this, in my view, where he tells a story of, in the book, of looking at a program, I believe, in New York City that takes formerly homeless men and equips them with skills and kind of puts them on a trajectory of work. And he tells a story of an individual he's talking to who was part of this program, who said, when he's asked, okay, well, how does it feel to be working and to kind of be on this path? And this gentleman reaches into his pocket and pulls out an iPhone. And Arthur Brooks in the book, he said, I thought he was going to say, look what I can buy. I can afford to buy these great things now. But that's not what he said. He pulled out his phone. He pulled up an email from his boss and said, look, my boss says, hey, we have a job that we need done ASAP. We need it done well, and I need you there for it. And this individual is saying, I'm needed. I'm valued. I have dignity and purpose in my work. And that's a beautiful thing that I think gets ignored in our policy conversation sometimes.
Absolutely. It's easy. There's a Atlanta poverty fighter, a true poverty fighter, that years ago wrote a book called Toxic Charity. And the whole idea behind the book was that oftentimes our impulse to just give things to people to address the symptoms of poverty are well-intentioned, but they can often do harm. They're actually toxic for the very, very reason that you just alluded to, right? It's a guy who misses out on the opportunity of having that sense of purpose and having a boss saying, you belong to this endeavor. There's a sense of well-being that we derive from knowing that we're needed. There's a sense of well-being that we derive from experiencing the fruits of our own labor. And we underplay those things. I remember years ago, Nick, and this was actually a shocking moment. I was part of a group here of philanthropists and business leaders, nonprofit leaders, and I had been asked to facilitate a conversation about, the direction that philanthropy ought to take in this area. And there was a person in the room who basically said, after hearing about this idea of people needing work and self-sufficiency and a sense of purpose, this person said, they don't need any of that. They just need to be made comfortable. Well, that's the kind of attitude that is dehumanizing. And it just robs people of what it means to be human. That's the kind of thing you say about somebody you're putting into hospice. That's not something that you say about somebody who's perfectly healthy and ready to enter the workforce. That story that Arthur tells, and he's got more than that, and we do too from our work, and you do, and that says everything we need to know about the importance of what we're attempting to do at so many levels in Utah, Georgia, and across the country.
Well, Randy, let's talk about some of those specifics, because as you mentioned, one of the big pushes right now on what I would call it broadly just opportunity policy, anything in the public policy world, state or federal, that is designed to strengthen upward mobility for Americans who strive for that, who desperately want to work their way up and out of poverty. And the one-door legislation is one of those that you've articulated. But I want to see if we can draw a connection between the one-door policy and improving the safety net specifically, and kind of how those things interplay. But first, just as a refresher for our listeners, can you kind of give a quick encapsulation of what is the one-door policy that Georgia and other states are pushing for, and kind of where does it fit in this broader conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. I can do that. And of course, you know an awful lot about it because the whole idea originates in Utah. But the one-door model essentially takes workforce programs, government-funded, government-run workforce programs, and integrates them with welfare programs, safety net programs. Now, to your average listener or viewer, they're going to say, well, that just seems to make great sense, right? The reality is Utah is the only state that has done that. They did it 25 years ago, basically, more than a quarter of a century ago. And then soon after, Congress passed some laws with regard to how workforce programs are funded that basically eliminated the option for other states to do what Utah did. That Utah was grandfathered in. But now in Utah, describe the difference. Let me actually start in other states. If somebody loses a job and they need benefits, they're very likely going to multiple welfare offices to make sure they're getting the benefit that they need for their family, whatever it may be. In Utah, people go to the Department of Workforce Services, where they are described as a customer, not a recipient, a customer, someone with dignity, somebody who needs to be served well. And the whole mindset is, how do we meet your immediate need? Yes, but how do we move you back into the workforce? So again, this is something you can describe well, Nick, but it's amazing to me that Utah is the only state that's done it, the only state currently that can do it, although we believe that's about to change. But we're very excited about giving states the flexibility to integrate those programs. And by the way, Nick, you go to these offices, you've been on tours of Department of Workforce Service offices. What stands out to you You see it right there in your own world.
Well, and I used to work for the Department of Workforce Services here in Utah many years ago, earlier on in my career, and my role was to manage the public facing message with the press, with members of the public. I was also on the legislative affairs team, so a lot of it was sort of telling the story of DWS to reporters, to the public, to legislators. And the thing that has always stood out to me ever since working there and being involved in these issues since then is kind of to build on what you said. It's this idea of every single person who walks through the door, either physically or virtually online, has something to offer to their community, to the state, to the country. And it really is such a dignified approach that it's about building up the person, yes, stabilizing, yes, providing some temporary assistance because they're in a rough spot and they need some help addressing some immediate needs, but then very quickly focusing them on, okay, how can we get you into training or education programs? They have, at least when I was there, they had programs that helped people just know how to navigate the world of looking for work and applying and interviewing and building up resumes. It's really skill set based. It's very much teach a man to fish kind of approach. And I'll share a brief anecdote. I've mentioned this a couple times on this show and in other venues, but I think it encapsulates this perfectly well. When I was working for the Department of Workforce Services, in the course of my duties, I interacted with a man who was formerly homeless here in Utah. That he had been homeless on the streets in Salt Lake City, and he was in a supportive housing program that the state was administering at the time. And when I was talking to him, I just casually asked, like, what do you need? What would be helpful to you? What do you wish the state would do differently or the federal government would do differently to help people like you in your situation? And I honestly thought he was going to say something along the lines of, well, more money, more benefits, give people like me more things to help stabilize their circumstance. That's what I was expecting. What he said instead was, and I didn't coach him on this prior, what he said was, I just want a hand up, not a hand out. And he talked about how badly he wanted to work and earn money to provide and again, kind of earn his way up and out of poverty. And I have never forgotten that experience because that encapsulates so perfectly what I think so many people just in their heart desire and what Utah's system is built around and strives for. And to your point about the one-door policy, that's what I'm hopeful will resonate with policymakers at the federal level and in other states, that Utah is a great example of our strong economy, a diverse economy, great upward mobility, and this sort of integrated administration where yes, we're here to help you, but we're also here to empower you. And I hope that becomes the norm nationwide.
Yeah, Nick, I want to add another story to that because it's very similar to the story you just told. We met a man named Adolphus a number of years ago while we were working on prisoner reentry issues, right? I mean, one of the key predictors of whether or not somebody leaving prison is going to stay out of prison is whether or not they work, they have a job. And we met Adolphus. Adolphus, I'm going to be honest with you, and this does not reflect well on me. I'll just say that right up front. 59 years old. He had been arrested over 90 times. He had served 6 prison terms. That is precisely the guy, and by his own admission, he had never had a legitimate job. That is precisely the kind of person I would be inclined to give up on. And yet, at 59 years old, Adolphus got kind of a Social Security statement that said he had not made a single contribution. And it hit him like a ton of bricks, financial contribution. And it hit him like a ton of bricks. And he wanted to work. And when we met Adolphus, it was at 59 when that happened, when he saw that statement, but he was 63 or 4 when we met him, and he was gainfully employed, loving his job, and mentoring homeless or formerly homeless men and formerly incarcerated men on how they could enter the workforce. I'll tell you what, that says everything we need to know. 59-year-old man, never had a legitimate job, criminal history, but he wanted the dignity of work. And we just can't give up on people. It's not the right thing to do.
Well, Randy, if I can build on that, because that innate desire for work and providing a better life for yourself and your family, that really has factored into, again, Utah's approach more broadly, as well as some new research from us here at Sutherland Institute with a new paper called Strengthening the American Dream, where the focus is really trying to understand how people who participate in the social safety net, the customers of DWS, as you articulated the term they use, how they see their ability to take work opportunities and how that factors into their desires and their efforts to make their families better off. And I want to share some of the takeaways with you and get your response to it. First, I think it's always vital to start from a foundation from this conversation of kind of two things. Number one, this is about the people, the families who desire work, but at times feel like there are some obstacles in their way. And this is about clearing their path and empowering them to feel more confident or be more able to take advantage of those work opportunities. And the second thing is that it's important to recognize, especially here in Utah, that we're kind of approaching this from a good to great framing. And I don't mean that to just brag and say Utah is the greatest, but we had an AEI scholar, Ian Rowe, here for an event a couple years ago, where he was speaking about upward mobility efforts across a range of issues here in Utah. And he used that analogy. He used this good to great metaphor. And the reason he articulated it was that it doesn't downplay the accomplishments of the state of Utah in the upward mobility space. All it does is say there's always a higher level of greatness you can aspire to. And so that's kind of the theme for our approach, that, again, Utah's administration of these programs is in many ways kind of the envy of the nation, or at least many other states that want to replicate what Utah is doing. And you look at the evidence of that success, that we have multiple metrics showing the best upward mobility in the nation. We have one of the most diverse economies in the nation. Our unemployment rates and poverty rates are consistently low. So you go down the list of metrics of economic opportunity, and obviously I'm biased because I live here in Utah, but I think you would be hard-pressed to find a place that is a better environment for folks who want to improve their prospects and take advantage of opportunity. And it's all those things combined. And so I think anytime we talk about safety net reform, it's vital to point out that we are not, and never should be, and it should never be interpreted as an indictment of the families who are participating in these programs, because they're working hard and they're trying to improve. And it also should not be an indictment of the caseworkers and the administrators, the folks that execute and operate these programs at the state level, because here in Utah, I think they do a good job. And yes, there's some room for improvement, but again, it's a cadre of people who are committed, who are passionate, who want to help their struggling fellow Utahns. And so that's why I give a lot of airtime to this idea of we're doing some really, really good things in Utah, but it's because we are so good at upward mobility, for lack of a better terms, that we also want to keep doing a little bit better. So I just want to start out with that framing. And I guess maybe before I jump into some of the survey data to get you to respond to, that message of articulating the need for some improvements to our social safety net and our workforce programs, how do we do it in such a way that no one out there is going to look at any of this and say, well, you see, the people on these programs are lazy or don't actually want to work, or the people administrating these are just bureaucrats. How do we channel it to the correct message talking about this, Georgia, Utah, and other states and nationally?
Well, I think you start assuming the best about people. I think one of the things about the one door, let me take a step back. The reality is that workers have to operate within the system they're given, right? So if you're working in a government agency, you have to operate within the system that you're given. That's reality. And there are a lot of people in those agencies doing the best they can, but they're limited by the system. Now, the good news is that in Utah, that system is friendlier to innovation and to what I would call customer care than any other state in the country. And I'm confident of that. But the reality is that more can be done. And that's always going to be the case. And I think one thing that might be worth saying here, Nick, just so, guests can understand kind of why things are the way they are. We typically, you hear the term welfare system quite a bit. It's thrown around in politics and government all the time. Well, the reality is we really don't have a system. It's a mishmash of government programs that have been developed over decades, many decades, to address very specific needs. And for many decades, nobody really had a clear picture of how those benefits stacked up and where people might lose their benefits if their pay increased just a little. So that's one of the things that we went to work on was let's solve that problem so we have a clear line of sight. When I say solve that problem, I should say we wanted to provide people with a line of sight to how the system is really working because nobody really had that. So my point in mentioning that is what I just described is a systemic problem. And no matter how good your people are, you're not going to be able to solve that problem when you've got all these different programs don't interact or intersect much. What Utah did with One Door is they started to break down the silos, brought them under one roof. People come through One Door. It's an encouraging way to go. But we need to give workers the benefit of the doubt. They care about the people they're serving, and give the job seeker, the welfare recipient, the benefit of the doubt as well. We've got plenty of stories of people whose hearts were broken because they felt they had to turn down a pay increase or a job because it would have put their kids at risk. People want to work, and I think that's one of the most important things we've got to begin with when we think about reforming.
I couldn't agree more. And to build on that, I want to talk about some of our research findings that underscores that point, that I think that the message is twofold. Number one, we've seen anecdotes. Again, in Georgia, you all have put together some great stories exemplifying this. We've done the same here in Utah, where you see the stories of people who are articulating what you just said, that I'm desperate to work. I don't want to stay on these programs forever. And in fact, our new research paper on this weaves in those stories throughout, showing, that people are eager and hungry for work. And then the second message is that they at times feel disincentivized or discouraged. And this goes to the amazing work of GCO on the issue of benefits cliffs, and something that Sutherland is working on as well. Again, it's a great partnership between the organizations. We get to work on this issue together. But is that if people see in front of them sort of this question mark or this fear of, well, if I take an economic opportunity, if I increase my income in some way, I perceive that will actually make me worse off, or I'm not sure if it'll make me worse off or better off, and they're making decisions accordingly. And Randy, I think one of the things that stands out so much about, again, what you all at GCO have done and how this issue has advanced is, for years there have been discussions about benefits cliffs, national level in various states. There are some great calculator tools. GCO has one that's very instructive. The Atlanta Federal Reserve has some tools as well. But in my mind, that there was always kind of came back to this question of, okay, we can sort of map out in policy terms what these programs might look like and sort of estimate or average out where benefit levels would change relative to earned income for a given household. But this lingering question was always, well, how often are people actually turning down opportunities? Because we have the anecdotes. We have tons of anecdotal evidence. But this question of what is the scope and scale of families saying no to economic opportunities because they're afraid of triggering a benefit cliff? And that's essentially what we sought to answer. So Sutherland Institute, again, after working with GCO for a while on this issue, Sutherland partnered with Lighthouse Research, which is a survey research firm here in Utah. And together we put together a public opinion survey, put it in the field in Utah. It's statewide. It's statistically significant data, and it's specifically asking participants in the social safety net what their experience has been. And if you'll permit me, I want to mention a couple of those highlights and kind of ask for your response and how you think this factors into the issue overall. Does it jive with what you're seeing in Georgia and in other states and at the national level? And a couple of things to highlight. So we wanted to get a sense of, first, what's kind of the general sentiment of safety net participants here in Utah. And according to our survey data, a couple of key standouts. Number one, 77% of respondents were worried that earning additional income would result in a loss of benefits that would make their family worse off. So that captures the benefit cliff or the fear of the benefit cliff perfectly, that a supermajority said, well, I'm worried. If I earn more, if I work harder, I'm actually going to end up worse off because the loss of benefits will eclipse the additional earned income I brought in. Similarly, 62% of respondents said that they feel stuck in a low-income job, again, for kind of the same reason. But then, Randy, here's a really interesting part. We really wanted to drill down to, okay, what are people specifically doing? It's one thing to capture, how do you feel? What are you worried about? But we wanted to ask folks, what have you actually done? Are there actions you have specifically taken? And we asked a range of what we call in this new research paper, intentional earnings reductions. And we kind of mapped them out and said, okay, have you ever done one of these things? And I won't list all of them. We'll link to the paper in the show notes. But the top few are things like turn down a job, turn down hours, worked fewer hours, quit a job they were already employed at, or just decided to not look for or pursue a new job, kind of a plateau effect. And interestingly, the top three responses of all of our respondents, 29% said at some point they had decided to not look for or pursue a new job, raise, or promotion for fear of triggering a benefit cliff. The next most common behavior down was 19%, so about 1 in 5, that said they had at some point worked fewer hours than were available to them because, again, they didn't want to earn too much and trigger a benefit cliff. And then 13% said they had turned down an offer for a new job. So a little more than 1 in 10 had done that at some point. And I'll mention, just because you mentioned the family component as well, which I know is a big focus of GCO, it factors into the success sequence. There was about a 9% response rate. So 9% of our respondents, so roughly 1 in 10, said that at some point they had decided to not get married because they were worried about triggering a cliff effect. And the last thing I'll mention, to not make it too stats heavy, because this is a podcast discussion, is that we also asked folks, what are the programs you're most concerned about losing? And by and large, Medicaid and food stamps, or the SNAP program, were the ones they identified that they're most concerned about. So I just threw a ton at you. What's your reaction to that? How does that jive with what you're seeing in Georgia and elsewhere?
And none of that surprises me, Nick. I mean, I'm glad you guys have done the research that kind of, to some degree, I would say, proves that this is going on out there. But this is exactly the kind of thing we know from story after story, conversation after conversation. Parents who are concerned, particularly as you mentioned, with losing Medicaid and SNAP. I mean, that's primarily a child-related concern. And those are typically single moms who are terribly concerned about the well-being of their kids. And, I think the mistake I once made, it's been a long time since I had, but I used to think, man, I just don't know if these people are trying very hard. And the reality is the majority of these people want to succeed for their families. They want to do a good job of providing for their kids. They're not looking at sitting around and doing nothing. The system has discouraged it. Sometimes the communities they live in discourage it for a variety of reasons. High crime areas, for instance, it's hard to find work, quite frankly. But everything you just said resonates and rings true with what we have seen. I'll tell you one story that has always stood out to me. It's a story I probably tell more than any other, because I think it just gives the best picture of what you just described, by the way. An Atlanta businessman a few years ago mentioned that on a Friday afternoon, he had invited one of his employees, a single mom, into his office, and he gave her a promotion and a pay raise. And she was thrilled. I mean, had tears in her eyes. She was absolutely thrilled. So again, it's single mom, job promotion, pay raise. Left in tears. Came back on Monday morning, also in tears, and turned it all down. And the reason she did was she was convinced that she was going to lose thousands more in government assistance than she was going to gain in pay. And the thing I always say about that, Nick, is that the tears tell you everything you need to know. And if it was just about the numbers, there aren't any tears, right? It's just, I just need the numbers. I just need dollars to add up so I can do these things for my family. The tears were about losing an opportunity, right? An opportunity for herself, an opportunity to grow, an opportunity to provide for her family. It says everything we need to know about so many of these recipients. They're not just wanting to, as some might say, eat from the government trough. That's just not it. It's desperation that often puts them in that situation.
Well, that's an amazing story, Randy, and thanks for sharing that. I'll underscore that again, I think the survey data, I would call it experiential data, because surveys, yes, they have constraints. Anytime you do a public opinion survey, they're statistical and methodological constraints, but they're valuable contributions because they articulate a story about the experience, about the decisions that people are making and why they're making those decisions. And that coupled with, again, these numerous anecdotes, and we've seen that here in Utah as well. When we've talked to folks, we had a woman named Marcella on this very podcast a while back who shared her story of wanting to work and progress economically, another single mom who wants nothing more than to work and earn enough so that she doesn't need these programs anymore. And she shared stories about turning down hours in the past, that she could have taken on more clients, more hours, but she said no, because she said, well, if I do that, I'm going to lose a lot of food stamp resources, and that's what I'm concerned about. And so it just, the stories with the data, with, again, the analyses and tools that are out there, in my mind, it is building this case for reform. Now the question becomes, well, what kinds of reforms do we need? And I've got to acknowledge, and again, we called this out in the Sutherland paper as well, that there very well may be different perspectives on the true nature and scope of what's causing this issue. How much of it is a true structural problem in the way these programs are built as far as the eligibility cutoffs and the benefit amounts. How much of it is maybe an information gap or an education gap that some of these families could benefit from a more precise understanding of how income impacts their benefits or what other resources are out there. But I want to maybe tee that up to you, and in the minutes we have left, talk about things in terms of solutions. Where do we go from here? How do we, and again, wrangle all of this to make a difference for these families?
Yeah, so I appreciate that question, Nick. First of all, it again starts with one door. And the reason is it creates the administrative structure within which you can address some of these problems with benefits cliffs and things like that. Without getting these programs under one roof, it's going to be very difficult to address. So you need to create a case management kind of environment where a case manager can understand an individual's circumstances and steer them towards real solutions. So that's one thing. The other thing we need to do is address kind of the big programs that often cause people to drop out of the workforce or to turn down jobs. That's Medicaid, SNAP, and then the third one would be childcare. Those are the big concerns typically for parents. So we need to make a more dynamic system that tapers kind of as you go, as opposed to plateauing and then suddenly dropping. So I think those are things that are very important. We think that because of where Utah is, that they've been living with that administrative structure that allows for this kind of assessment and solution making. We believe Utah is the place to kind of lead the way on that, while we continue to get other states to push for the one-door option for themselves. So that's kind of a general summary. It's that one-door policy is so important. You've already got it. So you guys in Utah need to move on to how do you address some of those big programs? How do you get those to taper humanely and reasonably so that people don't have to miss work or make a choice between providing for their kids and taking a job promotion?
Well, I'll editorialize a little bit more about Utah in response to that, and then ask you kind of a final question about unity on this issue. Again, especially on the heels of an election season, I think it's relevant. But on the Utah point, one of the things that we found, again, going through and doing the survey research and looking at kind of Utah's track record, is that the state of Utah very much has this spirit of continuous improvement. You can go back for years and you can look at things the state has done on the TANF cash assistance side to help smooth the transition. The state has done things on childcare. And as you said, just the very structure of the administration is very much focused on how do we help get you off these programs and into self-reliance through work. And so I think, even though, again, there's still some refinements to be made and still some improvements to happen, I think the fact that Utah has that history, that trajectory of continuous improvement, how can we improve what we do at the state? I'll give you another great example. In 2012, the state legislature here in Utah passed something called the Intergenerational Poverty Mitigation Act, which started a decade-plus long effort to understand and address, again, a more chronic form of poverty that goes from one generation to the next, and customize some solutions to address that. And that effort continues today. And so that there's just so many examples of, I would agree with you, that Utah is primed to be a leader on this, because it already has been. And that's why I'm hopeful we can make a difference and continue to work with states like Georgia and others, and work with folks at the federal level to, again, create what I would call sort of this consensus unifying opportunity agenda to help these families throughout the nation.
I agree with that. And I think there's a tremendous opportunity kind of getting to a point you kind of mentioned in passing. I think there's an opportunity to cross ideological divides. I think it's fairly easy to do so, actually. The key is not playing a blame game. It's not assuming the worst of people who may have been involved in building a program in the first place or supporting it. We just can't do the blame game. The reality is most Americans on the right and the left are concerned about their fellow Americans, and we can unite on this. I think one of the most telling things, and I read this often because it really points to, I think, the reality and the possibility that we can work together across ideological and political divides. So in 1935, Franklin Roosevelt gave his State of the Union address. Now, he's 2 years into his administration. We're multiple years into the Depression. He's the one that's launched all these welfare programs, kind of the beginning of many of the welfare programs we have now. And one of the things he bemoaned during his speech was the fact that they were doling out relief without requiring work. This is FDR. And he said to dole out relief in this way is to administer a narcotic. Now, this is the phrase that really gets to me: a subtle destroyer of the human spirit. FDR saw that as a destroyer of the human spirit. He said, work must be found for able-bodied but destitute workers. And then he said this, he said a number of things, but he said, we must preserve not only the bodies of the unemployed from destitution, but also their self-respect, their self-reliance, and courage and determination. That was FDR. And the point is that he's a Democrat. He was a Democrat. He is still highly revered in the Democrat Party. And there are Republicans who are pushing for reform, and they've pushed it for all sorts of reasons, sometimes perhaps related to fraud and overspending. But where we can all come together is around that concern mentioned by FDR, right? This idea that, it's about the recipient. It's about that person who's out of work and wants an opportunity to flourish. The last thing I'll say is this: hope is important for human flourishing. We've got to believe that the future can be better than the present. And when people can't find a way out, it's hard to have hope. When they can't find a way out of their circumstances, changing the way the system works restores hope and increases the likelihood that people will flourish in the future.
Well, Randy, that's a great way to end. I usually kind of have to prod people to end on a hopeful note, but you did it there for us anyway. So thank you. And I just have to say thank you to you and the team at GCO for everything you all are doing on this issue. And again, the wonderful partnership between our organizations to try and make a difference and again, strengthen the American dream for these families. And of course, thank you for your time being with us on Defending Ideas. Any closing thoughts? And if not, we'll call it there. I think this is a very inspiring conversation for our listeners.
Yeah, my last thought would be this. I know this has been a divisive time, but I think this is a unifying issue. Pick the right language, tell the right stories, position the recipient as the hero, and we've got something that Americans can unite on. And so I'm really hopeful from that perspective, and again, grateful for your partnership, Nick.
Once again, that is Randy Hicks, President and CEO of the Georgia Center for Opportunity. Randy, thank you so much for lending your time and expertise on Defending Ideas. We're going to take a quick break before we leave you with some final talking points. This is Defending Ideas. We'll be right back.
Sometimes it's hard to keep up with the latest policy debate that affects your life. The solution? Subscribe to Sutherland Institute's weekly newsletter, where you'll find in-depth insights from seasoned policy experts, compelling multimedia, and advance notice of special events. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. For anyone who wants to be a fellow champion of upward mobility, who wants to be part of this conversation about improving government programs to empower more Americans to achieve self-reliance through work, there are some key messages that we have to get right. Number one, the individual families who participate in these programs are the heroes of the story. They're already working hard to try and provide a better life for their kids. They don't want to stay on government programs. They would much rather work and earn enough to be self-sufficient. We should always use this message whenever we start a discussion about social safety net reform. Number two, we have to start from a foundation of success, which means recognizing the strengths and accomplishments of the social safety net system that has helped millions of Americans avoid true material destitution. This is especially true in Utah, where our unique model of co-locating workforce and welfare programs in the same state agency is something other states aspire to. We want to go from good to great. And number three, there's still more work to do. In particular, as a state and nation, we need to have a discussion about why some families feel that working harder will affect their benefits in a way that will actually make them worse off. Whether there are true structural barriers or education gaps, or a combination of both. There are important reforms that we can pursue to make a difference for these families. That's it for this episode of Defending Ideas. If you enjoyed this discussion, please visit defendingideas.org, where you can access previous episodes and watch or listen on your favorite platform. Don't forget to subscribe to Defending Ideas on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you like to get your shows. Just search for Defending Ideas, and please share this episode on your own social media profiles or with a friend or family member or coworker, anyone who you think might find it interesting. Lastly, if you want to support the broad work of Sutherland Institute, if you want more conversations like this, please make a contribution at sutherlandinstitute.org/donate. Thanks for joining us on Defending Ideas. From the Sutherland Institute in Salt Lake City, I'm Nic Dunn. We'll see you next time.